Ready? Can everybody hear me okay? This desk is really high. I feel really small right now, but I'll do my best. So thank you for attending this talk. I was just kind of joking around that I wasn't expecting this number of people to show up today, because when Alessandra first asked me to give a talk at this conference, obviously I immediately said yes. And then I asked her, what would you like me to speak about? Because there can be a number of topics that I could give a talk on. And she said, well, I go to conferences a lot, and we talk about a lot of interesting topics on game design and business and marketing and promotion and all that stuff, but we don't really talk about the financing side of things too often. And I think it's a shame because it's really important, and I see a lot of developers struggling in that respect. So I immediately said, yes, I agree with you. I see this with a lot of my clients very often. I'm going to put this talk together. And then I started working on this talk, and I realized why we don't see too many talks on this topic. Because, first of all, it's really hard to make it entertaining to talk about financing. Video game financing is also a very large topic to fit in 40 minutes, I found. But I stuck with it. I'm doing it anyway, because often I see games with a lot of potential dying on the vine, and I think that's a real shame. So hopefully, this talk is 40 minutes. It's not a lot. We can't really dive deep and go into a lot of detail. We might or might not get to the questions at the end, but I've put my contact details up so that you can reach out to me at a later date, or you can come find me afterwards or grab a card, by all means. But if I achieve anything today, I hope that you will all leave the room with a newfound appreciation for video game financing and a motivation to double whatever the time it is that you spend on determining your funding mix, and I'll be happy. So I'm going to give that a shot. So who am I? My name is Leonie. Thank you, Rebecca, for pronouncing that correctly. I'm a co-founder at IndieDevKit.com. That is a website with bespoke services for self-publishing game developers. We also have a lot of do-it-yourself guides that you can download, and we have some free online wizards as well. I also help studios on a contracting basis, studios worldwide, and usually it's all of their non-development work. So whether that's marketing or promotion or financing, funding, other operational issues that they run into. Before that, I started my career at Sony Music, back when CDs were still hot. That seems like a really long time ago. I've spent a lot of years at Activision, at Midway Games, and my last salary job was I was a vice president at Irrational Games in Boston. So as such, in all my various roles, I've helped a number of clients secure funding, and I've worked on many projects with P&L responsibilities. And for those of you who don't know what that means, P&L is basically corporate speak for profit and loss. So that means that you're held accountable for profits and losses. So that's me. The talk today is about being aware about how today's choices impact the bottom line, and thus your next title. So it's about funding, financing, and how the choices you make there impact your next title, because we tend to focus on the project that we're working on right now, or the project that we're about to start, and we don't think too much long term, and hopefully this talk will change that view a little bit. So I'm going to break it down. This talk, I've made 3 baseline assumptions that I just want to outline so that you guys understand where I'm coming from and we're all on the same page. So number 1 being that making games costs money. So if it's a really small game, it will be little money. If it's a very large game, it will be a lot of money. Secondly, money costs money, right? If you take out a loan, you pay interest. If you have a publisher, you pay royalties. If you have a VC, you give up equity. So there's very little free money out in the world. And then thirdly, my assumption is that any game developer is working on a project because they want people to play their game and to be successful. And at the end of that to have money left to start their next project. And hopefully it's more money than they had before so that their next project can be bigger and better and more fun. So those are my assumptions going into this talk. The approach that I want to take, is with the eye on longevity, right? A long future for you as a developer. As I see it, when we're speaking about finances, we break that down into 3 steps. Number 1, determining your funding need. How much do you need? Why is that the amount that you need? The middle part, where we're going to spend most of the time, is determining your ideal funding mix, with the focus on your ideal funding mix, because it's probably a different answer for every individual in this room. And then thirdly, once you obtain that funding and you have that money to fund your development cycle, to keep an eye on making sure that you are on track so that your project is not going to run off the rails because suddenly the cash is all gone. So these are 3 key steps when it comes to finances. Now, the first one sounds extremely obvious, right? Put together a realistic budget and a cash flow plan. Basically, what this means is figure out what you need and when you need it. Most people that I meet have already put together some sort of budget. And most people that I talk to are kind of iffy on the whole cash flow plan thing because it's a spreadsheet and it's annoying and it's boring and it's very tedious work. So usually they're about to get started on that cash flow plan and they might not do it unless it's asked of them in an application for a grant or a subsidy or something like that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why these 2 are so important, right? So the first one, the budget, it's really about continuity, right? If you get your budget right from the start and you know exactly how much funding you need and you obtain that funding, that will allow you to have a continuous development process. I meet a lot of developers that get interrupted in their development process because they run out of money. And that is very bad for a number of reasons. Right, 1, it's just plain annoying because now they have all this stress. The business managers at these studios, usually there's somebody responsible for making sure there's enough cash. That person has his day-to-day job, but now also has his other responsibility of going out and finding cash. And they need to spend time to find a publisher, a VC, a bank, get a loan somewhere, and it's very stressful. And when you're in a desperate situation, desperate times, desperate measures, you might not get the ideal solution that you would have wanted, and your negotiation position isn't as great. The other problem is that when you interrupt your project, not only do you interrupt the creative flow, it's also your staff, right? If you work with a lot of freelancers or contractors that you can no longer pay, they're going to take another job, and they might or might not come back. Or as a studio, you might take on some work for hire, and you're going to need to put this on pause until you build your reserves back up. So it's very, very annoying when this happens. And I would urge you to double the time that you spend in the budgeting phase, right? Because the question is obviously, well, what is a realistic budget? And it's different for everybody. I can't tell you what your realistic budget is. But double the time you spend on it to make sure things that you can do. We have a budget wizard on our website that kind of takes you step by step, and it asks you all the questions, and it forces you to think about what things might cost and fill them in and total them up. But even that isn't enough. When you're done, start talking to people. Talk to other business owners that you know and ask them, what surprised you? What did you miss? What did you forget? Assume the worst case scenario. Assume that everything is going to go wrong. Assume that you're forgetting things, right? Spend a lot more time internally with your team and ask very specific questions. You can't ask too many questions, right? Like, how many characters do we have is it realistic that we need to animate all of these with one animator? Is that really, should we budget for one really, or should it be two, or should it be three? You know, are we gonna change our minds in terms of the platforms that we're on? Are we certain that it's gonna be this? Are we certain that we're not gonna localize, right? Just make sure that you've had these conversations with your team, and hopefully spending more time on this in this phase is gonna help you a lot later on. And later on, link to the budget wizard if you're interested. So the cash flow plan is another one. This is a very simplistic, fictional version of a cash flow plan in monkey dollars. This is all fake. But basically, for people that don't know, a cash flow plan is a month-by-month plan, usually in Excel spreadsheet, that shows you how much cash you have coming in every month and how much cash you have going out every month. And obviously, you want more cash coming in than cash coming out. Now, in this example, you see that this team is all right. This project is fine. They have more cash coming in, the green line, than they have going out, which is the red line. And that's fine, but they have a couple of scary moments here, right? Like that third green bubble goes up from 18 monkey dollars to 38. And that's a very crucial moment for this team. So what this plan does is it warns you that you need to pay attention ahead of time, right? Because if you only find out in month 3 that you're not getting this $20, then your cash flow is gonna look like this, and you're gonna be in trouble. So what the cash flow plan allows you to do is recognize the warning signs. So very early on here, you know, in month 1, I don't know where this money is coming from. Maybe you're expecting a milestone payment from a publisher. In month 1, you should know for sure whether or not you're getting this money, right? You should be meeting these people, asking them. If they're about to go bankrupt and you don't know about it, that would be really bad, and this plan is just gonna go south. So just don't assume anything. Make sure if there's an inkling in month 1 here that things might go wrong, take action, have a plan B, make sure that you know what you're gonna do in case this money is not gonna come in. So that's the cash flow plan. That's what you need when you need it. That's all great, and now you need to go and find the money somewhere, right? So that's the next step, the ideal funding mix. Now, luckily these days we have a lot of funding options available to us. I want to step through each of them briefly and kind of outline the pros and cons for each funding method that is out there. But I want to emphasize that, and we're going to get to this in later slides, that it's going to be in the mix, right? It's very rare that you can fund your game from simply one funding source. So let's step through these one by one, starting with self-funding, which is the best, obviously. This means that you can fund your entire project from your own financial reserves. So it could be cash that you have in the bank or money that you have under your bed in a sock. But it's the best because it's cheap. You know, previously we said money costs money. Well, in this case, you know, it doesn't. Well, there's an opportunity cost, obviously, because you can't spend it on something else if you've already spent it on this, but you don't owe anybody interest for spending this money. The other benefits are that it's fast, it's instantly available, it's right there. You have full control over your business decisions, which is fantastic. You can determine yourself when your game is coming out, where your game is coming out, what you want to do with it, and you have full creative ownership as well. This is all good stuff. The downside, obviously, you need to have the money to be able to self-fund your game, and very few people have enough money to cover the full amount for the entire game. Obviously, that depends on the amount that you need, right? If you make a very, very cheap game for $50,000, then some people might have that. Secondly, crowdfunding is one that is very familiar with our industry. There's all these types of crowdfunding. They keep evolving. You know, it's still rewards-based crowdfunding that our industry mainly works with, but we also now have options for equity-based crowdfunding where backers can share in our profits and in our revenues. There is debt-based crowdfunding where basically you take out microloans, and there is donation-based crowdfunding, things like Patreon, where people can donate money. So again, it's fairly cheap. You pay a fee to the platform owners, whether it's Kickstarter or Indiegogo, whatever. You pay a fee to credit card companies. Altogether, you pay about 10% in fees from the funding amount that you raise. But still fairly cheap. It's also fairly fast, right? You run a campaign for about a month, and then there is another month of administration time, and then in 2 or 3 months, you have the money in your bank account, which is great. And similar to self-funding, you still have control, you still have ownership. As an added bonus, you now also started building a community, and you got actual feedback from gamers on your concept, which is great. Downsides, again, it's very unlikely, depending on how much money you need to raise, that you're going to raise a full funding amount for the entire game. If it's a large game, if it's a smaller game, it's more likely to happen. Secondly, running a crowdfunding campaign is very, very labor intensive. I don't know if any of you have run a crowdfunding campaign before, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of people to answer to. So it's very, very intensive. Commitments. You make commitments very early on that are hard to change later, right? Usually people go to Kickstarter early in development and they need to outline their features, but if you have to cut them later, that will become an issue for your backers potentially, so you're going to have to manage that very carefully. And then lastly, one of the downsides is a very audience-specific method to raise money, right? By that I mean it's not right for every type of game, it's not right for every genre, it's not right for every platform, right? It's usually best done when there is a fan base, or at least a fan base for the genre that you're in, right? There's not a very avid fan base for a game of threes on mobile, right? So that will be a little bit harder to raise through crowdfunding. Then there's angel investors, and I kind of put them together with incubators because they're kind of like-minded and spirited. They're very similar to the venture capital world, which we're going to get to in the next step, in that they invest money early on in return for equity, right? And what that means is they give you money, but they expect you to do well, they will help you do well, and then when you get bought by a big company such as Google or Facebook or whoever, they're going to get a part of that money. So pros here, it's very focused, right? Instead of 4,000 backers, you now have one party to talk to and to negotiate with, which can be very nice, right? It saves you time in that regard. It can be quiet, meaning out of the public eye, right? If you are working on some proprietary technology that isn't ready for the public eye just yet, you could do this behind the scenes and just talk to these people offline until you're ready to make big announcements. Especially incubators offer a lot of operational supports, usually things like office space and free coffee and that sort of stuff. As well as coaching, right? They want you to succeed. They want you to do well. They usually have people on staff to help you out when and where you need it, which is great. And, these people do this. They take a risk very early on, usually in an earlier stage than venture capitalists would, because, they support what you do, they believe in what you do, and they have faith in you succeeding. Downsides, this is usually mostly interesting for startups, because if you're already an established developer with your own office and your own team, then you're not going to want to travel out to somebody else's office and go work from there, which is sometimes a requirement for incubators. It's a very slow process, right? Because you have to identify who these people are. You have to go out and meet them. Sometimes you have to travel to events a lot of times before you meet the right people. You have to pitch them. And then once they're interested, there's various rounds of pitching involved. You have to get their interest and then you negotiate, you sign. So this is a process of months, could be 3 to 6, it could be longer. And the last thing is you give up equity, right? You have to be comfortable with that as a business owner. Like, do I want to give up equity? How much am I comfortable with giving up? Why? What am I getting in return? Which is kind of similar in the venture capital world, right? Venture capital, kind of the same thing. They're in it for the long term. Can be very focused because it's a business-to-business relationship. You don't have to communicate with consumers on a regular basis. It can be behind the scenes if you want it to be. There is, depending on the VC firm that you sign with, variable levels of support that you can expect. Some offer more than others in terms of coaching and networking and all that sort of stuff. Big pro here is the money. There is usually a lot of money here, right? They don't all pay it at once. It is paid in multiple rounds. But if you need a couple of million, for instance, this would be a better bet than a crowdfunding campaign might be. With the caveat that, again, it's a long-term engagement. These people want you to be successful because they don't make their money until you are successful and you either merge or you're acquired by someone else. So again, very slow process, meeting the right people, pitching, negotiating. It's a lot like dating from that perspective. You give up equity, and it's very important to note that this is also very audience-specific because these guys are not interested necessarily in your project. These guys are interested in your company, right? And that's a big difference. It's very long-term, meaning that they're usually interested when there's a large user base that they can monetize that another company might be interested in purchasing. It could be technology that you have that is very interesting to another company. But in short, it's very important to know that it's long-term interest here in the company and your assets. We're getting there. So the next big one, publishers, advance royalties. It's a very traditional one in this industry. It has been around for a very long time. Obviously, it's great if you find the right publishing partners that they offer a lot of publishing services that you then don't need to worry about. They'll do your age rating submissions. Some of them do QA, localization support. They take care of your marketing and your promotions. They send your press releases, all that sort of stuff. They might build your website, and that can be very nice to not have to worry about any of that. Also, nice benefit here is larger sums of money available, depending on the project and how interested they are, obviously. But if you have a great project with great potential and they agree, then you can get more money here than you could through self-funding or other means. It's also a long-term investment. Obviously, they want you to be successful because the more units you sell, the more money they make also. So that's all very logical. Again, it's not fast money. It's going to be a lot of dating, so to speak, so networking, meeting the right people, negotiating, agreeing, getting the contract signed. That's another fun one that can take 6 weeks of lawyers going backwards and forwards. And important to note, it's probably one of the most expensive ways to fund your game, right? Depending on the type of deal that you sign and how many units you expect to sell, but these guys will take a large cut of your revenue. So that's something to keep in mind in your decision-making process. And lastly, you don't have full ownership anymore. You don't have full control anymore over when you announce what or where you launch when. And publishers are getting better and better every year in terms of creative involvement, but there still can be some, right? Some of them will have internal people that will review your game and might give you tips and notes that they won't force on you, but they kind of strongly advise that you will follow up on those. So then this one is interesting, early access, because I put it up here as a funding method. I know Valve doesn't see it that way. They see it as a development philosophy, right? Which is a big difference. But practically and realistically speaking, most developers that I meet really see this as a funding source to kind of get that cash in early during development, while at the same time also get testing done and get real-life feedback. So the plus sides here are that it's cheap. You know, you pay your usual fees to Steam or GOG or whichever early access platform you choose to work with, but you would have paid that anyway. You still have control, ownership, but you start building a community, and you get real feedback from players, actual data that you can work with and iterate on, which is awesome. So the downsides here is, again, it's very audience specific, right? It's still very heavily PC focused. A lot of narrative developers that I know will kind of shy away from early access because they worry about spoilers in the story. And it's very labor intensive. You have to update the build, ideally every 6 to 8 weeks. Your players will have questions. There's customer service support that happens if the next update breaks something that people have loved. You know, they will let you know for sure. So it's intense. Then there's grants and subsidies, a lot of them in Europe more than anywhere else, but they're pretty awesome because they're fairly close to free money. You know, in terms of not having to pay interest or anything like that, it's fairly fast. They usually don't ask you to give up a lot of control or ownership with some, you know, fine print in terms of where you outsource your development. It can't be in other countries sometimes, or some of them don't want you to do crowdfunding campaigns, and so it's always good to read the fine print. But generally speaking, there's a lot of freedom here. Again, the downside is, well, they're not going to fund your entire project. That's very unlikely. It will be a smaller sum of money that they pay out typically. And then the last one, loans, bank loans, private loans, any loans that you might have access to. Fairly cheap, you pay interest, and obviously it depends on how much. Fairly fast. The downside being the funding amount, right? What kind of credit status do you have? Some people will be able to take out a second mortgage on their house. Other people might not have a house, so it might be out of reach, right? Not everybody has a rich uncle that will lend them some money. So this one really depends on your personal situation in terms of what you have access to, but also what you're comfortable with, right? Like, are you really gonna put that second mortgage on your house and risk this project for that? Are you okay with that, or is it gonna keep you up every night? Right, that would be me, lots of options to fund, right? And the key is for you to understand how these funding methods work and then choose your ideal mix based on what you need, what you want, what your long-term goal is, what you're comfortable with. And that's not an easy task, right? It helps to know what you need so that you can figure out what is the most realistic funding source available to you. But it's important to get this mix right. And I just want to show you another fictional example to illustrate why it's so important to get this right. So this is another Monkey Dollar project. So this project, in my super simplistic example, has 50,000 in self-funding. Maybe they've had a previous game that they that did very well, and they have $50,000 in their bank account. And they're going to use that to make a prototype, and they're going to take that prototype and they're going to bring it to early access. And throughout development, they rake in $250,000, which is going to go back into development. And they pick up this grant along the way, and then they launch the game. And then it's a big question mark, right? Like, how well is it going to sell? Are they going to make back that investment of 50,000 K? But at least they're debt-free, right? They don't owe anybody any money other than themselves. That very same game could look like this, right? They could maybe start off the same way and have a prototype that they've worked on, but then they decided to pitch that prototype and shop it around to publishers. And they got a publishing deal. They got the same amount of money, $300,000 in an advance royalty, and then they shipped the game, right? So this kind of looks same but different, right? It's actually a huge difference here, because depending on how many units they sell, in this case, they might not make any money, right? Here, every copy that they sell is money that goes into their bank account. Here, not so much, because they're not going to make money until they pay $300,000 back to the publisher. That's why it's called an advance royalty. You're not going to get royalties from your publisher until you pay back the $300,000. Other differences, in this case, obviously they had to do all the hard work themselves, right? It's promotion, marketing, submissions, all of that they had to do themselves. These guys just purely focused on the development process and hoped that the publisher was doing a great job. In this case, too, they've built relationships with media, with streamers, with their audience. They've built a community, lasting relationships, and really in-depth learnings that they can take into the next project. In this case, they will have learned watching the publisher from the sidelines, but they don't have the direct relationships themselves. So it's the same, but it's very different. And you might ask, why would anybody take a publisher if you kind of look at it this simplistically? Well, sometimes you would, right? Sometimes if you expect to sell large amounts of units, then you might want this publishing deal, because then you don't have to worry about all that other stuff, and you expect to make enough money that you can afford to pay the $300,000 back at day one, right? And then make some royalties after that. If you expect to make like $3 million day one, then sure, you could go this route. So there is all these different kinds of ways that you can combine all these funding sources, and you can weight them differently, right? It is all going to depend on how much money you need in total, the type of project that you have in terms of which funding source is available to you or likely to be available to you. The expected returns that you have, are you expecting to sell a lot of units slam dunk, or is it very high risk? Or is it a small amount of units, very niche? What are your long-term goals as a studio? Do you want to be bought by someone else at some point? Would you never want that to happen? There's a lot of personal choices there too. Some people just don't want to deal with publishers. Other people don't want to deal with people. They don't want crowdfunding because they have to interact with people and talk to people, and they're not comfortable doing that, right? Other people love early access, and other people aren't comfortable showing their work this early on. So there's a lot of personal comfort level too that plays into all of these decisions, but it's a lot. There's a lot here, a lot than I'm even talking about today to consider here, but I'm just urging you to really just consider all of these options very carefully, and maybe speak to some colleagues about how they've experienced certain funding options if you're considering them, because it's important to get it right. So then we talked about what we need and when we need it, where we can go to look for the money, and then assuming that we found the money, then it's obviously very important to make sure that the money is going to be spent in the right way. So check on a regular basis if your actual spend is in line with your budget. If it's not, then maybe you have to seek more money, or maybe you have to spend less. Those are all decisions that you can make. But whether it's monthly, whether it's quarterly, whether it's every 6 months, whatever it is that you do, at least put it in your calendar to just check once in a while. And just on a day-to-day basis, just realize that any decision you make impacts your project from a financial perspective, right? You can't just hire an extra person without checking in with your finances. You can't just add a platform or add 10 new features that you hadn't planned for in your budget. So maybe you want to, maybe you have to cut something else to get something else in, or maybe you are going to find extra money somewhere, but just don't do it without thinking. That's the big one. So, to recap, find out what you need, when you need it, determine your ideal funding mix. Don't just choose a funding method because that's what your friend did or what somebody else said is the right thing to do. Like generalization here typically never works, so it's make your decisions on an individual basis, and then once you've secured your funding, just keep an eye on it and protect what you have. So those are my 3 tips. I just got a 5-minute warning, and so we have time for one question. Okay, one. Rebecca's running around with a microphone. Yep.
Yeah, hi. What was the first website again with the budget?
Yeah, I'll put that back up on the screen. That wasn't really a question, was it? Right? So we can do another one.
Hi, thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
How often do you see agile funding projects that are reevaluated every 3 or 4 weeks if it's worth investing more?
Yeah, I personally haven't come across any. Usually the partners that I work with are either VCs, co-financing firms, or publishers. And publishers are kind of, I guess maybe what you mean is that they have milestone schedules and milestone requirements. Usually that's kind of like a given with most publishers. So typically it's in the contract ahead of time. They set certain dates and certain milestones. They define the milestones, which is a huge backwards and forwards in the negotiation usually, because I can say I want to see an alpha build at this date, but alpha might mean something to you that might mean something different to me, right? So that is very common. If that's what you meant to ask, is that they set certain milestones and review milestones. If you are negotiating an agreement like that, I would urge you to be very specific on the what-if scenarios, because a lot of people will say, like, all right, well, you get paid if we review and approve these milestones, but what happens if they don't approve them? Or what happens if they don't approve them in time? Like, how much time do they have to approve them? Because this could drag on forever, right? Like, if you send me your alpha build or your first playable, and I'm gonna say, yeah, I'll review it, and then 6 months later, you still haven't heard, and you call me up, and I'm like, yeah, I'm still looking. And meanwhile, you don't have any money, right? So, anybody negotiating deals like that, just be very specific on what it is that you deliver, when, and what the contingencies are if things go wrong, right? Does that help?
I guess it just seems to me that a lot of these methods go towards the waterfall kind of project methodology instead of, for example, Scrum, where you can finish your project maybe earlier, just already done and ready for the market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe I'm just not understanding your question. We should talk a little bit offline. But yeah, the idea here is, and the assumption is that that you have a project that you're gonna get started on, and that from the start you're gonna need to figure out what you need and when. But that was the assumption. Thank you, guys.